Hey guys, so I recently added a new feature to my Blender add-on, Source Engine Collision Tools, that finally adds rigged collision support, which basically means that now with just a single button press, you can instantly generate collision for, let's say, ragdolls in Garry's mod, or player models, or dynamic props. So with this video, I'm going to show you some examples of what you can do with this new feature. And I'm also going to show you some tips and tricks on how to best use it and take advantage of it. So for the first example, this is Ike from the Fire Emblem series. And this was the first initial result that I got when I tested the feature on it. Now, first, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you where the feature even is first. Okay, so you'll go into where the add-on usually is, the object properties, and you'll see Source Engine Collision Tools, click on Generate, and then scroll down, you'll see Rigged. Okay, so that's the new feature. And right now there's just two settings for it. It's pretty simple. And the default setting for this one is 40%. This is 5%, it's 1. So 40 and 1. And most of the time you can just start with these default settings and see what you get. And the results are most likely going to be okay. But if not, you can tweak these settings. So let me go over what these settings do. So the strength threshold, this is basically the the weight level that needs to be met for each weight in the rig in order to actually be considered uh, for whole generation. So let's say maybe like for example the elbows. And the elbows, there's going to be a mix of weights. They're basically half and half, right? For the forearm and the bicep, the upper arm. And so here you're not going to get a hole there because the weights are not close enough to one, or there's not a weight there that's dominant. So you don't get a weight, so you don't get a hole there. That's what I meant to say. Um, Whereas here you do get a hole because these are higher weights, right? So if you hover your mouse over it, it also explains this. And it'll say a higher value will result in fewer holes, while a lower value will result in more. So basically, if you make this really low, then the weights don't need to be so high to meet that threshold, and so they'll be counted. Whereas if you make this really high, you'll get a lower amount of holes because there's a higher requirement that the weights need to meet, right? So that's what that does. And then the skip size, this is basically the equivalent of a feature that's already in the add-on, or that was already in the add-on before. It's the thinness features, find, merge, and remove thin holes, or specifically, in this case, remove thin holes. So basically, when the results are generated, this feature will check the skip size, and if a hole is smaller than this amount, um, and this is, by the way, it's comparing the average size of the holes. Okay, so it checks the average size or volume of all the holes in the collision mesh, and if there's something that's so small, it's in this case it'll be smaller than 1% of the average size, then it just deletes that hole. And you'll see that there's actually a hole that I can show you this with. There's a hole here that it should have been deleted, but it wasn't. And I think it's because when I generated this, I had a higher skip size. So if I were to set this to something like, let's say 5, okay, and I'll set this back to 40. Let me delete this mesh and regenerate it, okay? So place it back here, and I'm gonna press recommended settings just in case, and then press generate, okay? And so it takes just a second, and now look what we got. That tiny thin hole that was here is gone because I increased the skip size. So it skipped that hole because it was under 5% of the average size. So you can technically use this to also skip things like fingers, toes, any really, really small body parts like that, right? Or if you really, really want to, for some reason, you don't want to skip anything, you could just set this to 0 and it basically just turns that feature off. Okay. But I recommend always keeping this at least at 1. Okay. Because if you end up with any like junk holes that are like, let's say, and you might see this sometimes. If you have anything that is like paper thin, like this. Sometimes you get that, something like that, for some reason. Just some body part just to convert into collision very well. Okay. Um, as long as you have it set to at least one, most of the time, these junk, tiny flat holes that are basically don't contribute anything, they get skipped. They just get deleted for you automatically. Okay. And in this case, it looks like 1% was not enough. I think I had to increase it to five. Let me see. Let me generate it again with one just to show you. Okay, yeah. So you see that one was not enough to make this one get skipped because this one actually it's not paper thin. It's not. There actually is some depth to it, so that's why it didn't get skipped. But five did make it get skipped. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, moving on to the next example. This one is supersonic. Okay, so this one was really good. The results were really great, but um, you'll notice that there are holes here that honestly don't need to exist. They're they're not going to contribute anything to how the collision mesh actually behaves in game. And when you're working with dynamic collision, you want to make things as simple as possible. You want to keep things as low poly as possible. You want to minimize the amount of holes that you have in general. Okay, so right off the bat, the ones that we probably don't want are these. So I'm going to select part of them here and press Control L to highlight all of them. Okay, so these honestly, these need to go. Okay, now you'll find that if you go into the cleanup section of my add-on, usually in this case, the process inside holes feature will find those, and then you can just instantly delete them, right? Just press X and delete them, and there we go. We already cleaned it up quite a bit. And then these here, I think the thin holes one finds it. Oh no, not in this case. Okay, yeah. So let's try this one again. No, it didn't find any. Let's try increasing this to five and see what happens. Okay, so no, I don't think we want to delete those. I mean, it's up to you how detailed you want your collision mesh to be, right? If you want even the fingers to have like a ragdoll effect, then you can keep them, right? But in this case, yeah, I want to keep it as detailed as possible. So I probably would want to just delete these manually. I'll just select them and press delete or X these. Okay. All right. Now, what else? Let's look at this. So, another thing is that as I mentioned, you want to keep it as low poly as possible, right? And so what I like to do is I'll go into edit mode and then I press A to select everything. And then I do a limited dissolve with X and then set this to 15. Okay. Now, after doing that, there might be holes here that are now no longer convex. Okay. And thankfully I did also update the force convex feature in my add-on to now try to maintain the weights, the rigging. It used to just wipe them, right? If you had a rigged collision mesh and you use this feature on that in the past, it would just delete the rig. It would be gone. It would basically turn it into a static collision. But now it actually tries to preserve them, okay? And we can test that. So here's the armature. And so if I were to, okay, it's moving. Let me just select random parts. Okay, yeah, so it's still rigged. Let's try moving these here. Okay, yeah, it's still rigged. Let's try the fingers. Yep. So see, you can see that the rig was maintained, right? So all is good. Okay, so we were able to dissolve that and make it lower poly, and then at the same time, we've used force convex to make sure everything's still convex. Okay. All right, so that's it for that example. Now with this final example, this is Pluto from Kingdom Hearts or Disney stuff. So specifically, this was from Birth by Sleep, which was a PSP game. So it's pretty low poly because of that, right? And this is the main reason I wanted to show you this example. So when I tried my rig collision generator on this, I got this. And obviously, this is not good. It's missing entire sections of the body. And I was wondering, why did this happen? The other models I tested the feature on, it worked pretty well. But this one did not. And I thought, well, the other ones were higher poly. Maybe it's the polygon count. Maybe maybe this feature just works better on something that is higher poly. So what I did was went into edit mode and I highlighted everything with A, and I just right clicked and I chose subdivide. So basically that just made it higher poly. See, it's just higher poly. And so once I tested the feature on the higher poly copy, I made a copy first and then I subdivided the copy. It's over here. See, so here's a copy. And then I tested it and that's what I got. Obviously, that's much better, right? So subdividing it made a massive difference in the results. So that's something to keep in mind. If you get a collision mesh from this new feature that is missing body parts or just sections of the model, try subdividing it because maybe it's just too low poly. Maybe for some reason, subdividing it gives it more data to work with, so that's why the results are better. It makes sense to me, right? Now the other issue is though, well, there's actually two other issues. So yes, this looks better, right? But it's not actually necessarily better. Let me show you why. So let me generate that again, just to show you, because I think that one was the one that I cleaned up already. Okay, so it's generating, takes just a second. Okay, so here it is. And move it over here to demonstrate. So this looks good, but it has a few issues. So right off the bat, as I mentioned earlier, when you're working with dynamic collision, you want something as simple as possible within reason, right? You don't want it to be too high poly. And this is going to be higher poly because we started with something that was higher poly. So that as we just do basically what I did earlier with the supersonic model. We just highlight everything in edit mode and then press X, limited dissolve. Okay, and then set this to something like 15. Okay, that's much better. And this brings me to issue number two with this. So you'll notice that this result has vertices that are actually overlapping or touching, okay, in between different holes. Okay, so this hole is directly adjacent to this, and the vertices are touching. They're basically in the exact same location. And the problem with that is that, unfortunately, with the way that the force convex feature works, when it tries to preserve the weights, it's based on the location of the vertices. And so what will happen if there's no gap between these holes, then the vertex groups might get mixed up. And that's really bad because if you want a working ragdoll, for example, for Gary's mod, it's really important to have each hole assigned only to one bone. Okay, you don't want this hole to be assigned to, let's say, a bone over here or over here. It has to be assigned only to the bone that's right here in that exact same location. Otherwise, you start to have problems. Okay, if you've made ragdolls in the past, you probably know what I'm talking about. So, uh, as I mentioned before, when you use limited dissolve on the collision mesh, the result is not necessarily going to still be convex, right? I'm going to triangulate it real quick. And so we need to force convex on it. But if we do that right now, let me show you what happens. Let me just show you so you can see the problem that gets created when you do that. So let's take a look. So if I open the sidebar with the N key, you can see what vertex groups are assigned here. This is bone 003. Okay. Okay, so if I click on the vertex or the vertices on this hole and I check what vertex weight is assigned there, so you'll see this one has bone 003, this one has bone 026. That right off the bat is bad. Okay, that means we fucked up. There's something wrong here. It looks like this, or I should say this one right here, it copied the weight that was assigned here to this hole because they're in the exact same location, okay? And so, how do we fix that? How do we avoid that? Very simple. You just need to add a gap between all the holes, okay? So let me regenerate that. That's the nice part about all this, that, if you fuck up and you mess up the collision mesh, you can just regenerate it. No big deal. So don't feel scared to screw up. You can just start over. It doesn't take that long. Okay, so here we are again. As I said, we want to add a gap. Okay, so you go into edit mode and highlight everything and then press Alt S and add a tiny, tiny gap, okay? It doesn't need to be big. Even just a tiny one like this will help, okay? And functionally, it basically won't have any impact on the way it performs in game because it's so small. It's not going to make a difference, okay? But it will make a difference for us wanting to use the force convex feature on it because that small gap will prevent the weights from being mixed up between different holes that are touching, okay? So let's go ahead and use force convex on it. Okay, and let's check. That's bone 002, and then the one right next to it, bone 026. Perfect. So see, that tiny, tiny gap made a giant difference, even though it's so small. It prevented force convex from mixing up the weights from these holes that are touching each other, okay? Because they're not actually touching anymore. There's a tiny gap between them. And so just keep that in mind, right? So you want to keep things simple. So dissolve it and then triangulate it with Control T. And then, well, I mean, you probably don't need to triangulate it because when you use force convex, it triangulates it for you. Okay, I'm just used to doing it myself. So then let's try force convex, and there we go. And just to be safe, let's test it with the armature. So I moved it back to coordinate 000, so I can test it with the armature here. Let me just hide these. And let's test it. So let's move this around. Okay. Yep. Looks good. Okay. Yep. Everything is moving and deforming as you would expect. Perfect. Okay. So that's basically it. All right. Now keep in mind, this is a brand new feature, so there could be bugs. And so as always, this project is open source and there's a GitHub repository for it. So if you want to submit an issue, if you encountered a bug, please feel welcome to do so. You can also join my Discord and report any issues that you find there. I'm always happy to help people with my add-on. And if you happen to create something really cool with this, you're more than welcome to share screenshots or videos of it in my Discord. All right, that's it for now. If you have any questions about this feature or my add-on, feel free to leave me a comment down below. Thanks, everyone.